Tennessee had an opportunity to cement its place in the college football playoff in a game Saturday against Georgia, and the Vols, well, they went out with a whimper, and Tennessee now squarely on the college football playoff bubble. Welcome into SEC Football Unfiltered, our podcast from the USA Today Network. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside John Adams. We are just now a few weeks away from playoff selection Sunday, and the bubble is clearing up a little bit. LSU and Missouri, they did away with this charade of an idea that they are playoff contenders by losing and clearing up the bubble on Saturday. But with Tennessee, John, the situation remains a little bit complicated. Tennessee could have cleared the bubble a little bit by knocking out Georgia on Saturday and reaffirming its spot, but it went the other direction. Tennessee looked pretty solid in the first quarter, and then nothing doing after that. So now Tennessee's in this scenario where they could finish 10-2 and be on the outside looking in of the playoff. How realistic is that, do you think, that a two-loss Vols team that beat Alabama could not be among the 12 teams in the playoff?
Well, strength of schedule really hurts Tennessee. When it wants to make a case for why it should be in the playoff, it points to that 10-2 record, and it points to Alabama. That game stands out above all others for Tennessee. Tennessee hadn't beaten anybody else with fewer than 4 losses. It's just the luck of the draw with the schedule. The schedule is certainly a factor in Tennessee being 10-2. I don't think it would have wanted to have played Oklahoma's schedule, for example.
Right.
So, or South Carolina's. So I think if South Carolina had Missouri's schedule, we'd be talking about South Carolina being in the playoff.
Mm-hmm.
This is such a big factor. But when you try to make a case for Tennessee, it's kind of all about that Alabama game and its 10-2 record, assuming it wins its last 2 games. But there would be no debate if Tennessee would have taken care of business at Georgia, and that loss could come back to really haunt Tennessee, because it wasn't, in the end, it wasn't really a close game. It was Georgia coaching better, playing better, and taking care of business.
Yeah, here's the way I look at it is kind of what you're getting at. If Tennessee would have won, there would have been no debate. Tennessee would be in the playoff as long as it, didn't lose to Vanderbilt in the season finale, which we have to consider as a possibility. Vanderbilt has 6 wins, but you would think if they beat Georgia, they would have been in the playoff. Now they can't play their way in. I mean, they can win their next 2 games, but I don't think that alone will be enough to get Tennessee in. However, there are multiple avenues for Tennessee to get some help and still make the playoff. I'm going to give you 4 avenues that Tennessee could get help to get into the field, John, and you tell me which one of these you think might be most likely to happen and help Tennessee get into the field. So I'll rattle off these 4, and then we'll have your answer. So option number 1 is Ole Miss, which is probably safely in the playoff at this point, loses at the Swamp Saturday to Florida, which would be its 3rd loss and knock Ole Miss out of the playoff. So that's option 1. Option 2 is Indiana gets skunked so bad this Saturday by Ohio State that Indiana's credentials as an 11-1 team with a blowout loss to Ohio State get called into question. They get bumped in favor of Tennessee. That's option 2. Option 3 is Notre Dame, which has 1 loss already, loses in one of its final 2 games to either Army or USC. That's who Notre Dame finishes with. They probably can't afford to lose to either one. And then option 4 is Penn State, which is a 1-loss team right now. They finish with Minnesota and Maryland. So option 4 would be Penn State suffering a 2nd loss to either Minnesota or Maryland, which would probably put Penn State out and Tennessee in. Of those 4 opportunities, and those aren't the only opportunities for Tennessee, but maybe the most likely, which of the 4 do you think is the best possibility for Tennessee?
One really sticks out to me, Blake. That's Notre Dame at Southern Cal in the last game of the year. Notre Dame conceivably could lose to Army. I don't think that's realistic, though. It beat Navy already, another service academy team. I'm risking stereotyping here, but it handled Navy's option. I think it can handle Army's option attack. Notre Dame has a very good, very disciplined defense, but Southern Cal is a different matter. Southern California always has talent. It doesn't showcase that talent a lot of times, but it has the kind of talent where it can play an exceptional game, a game that sticks out above its record. I'm baffled that Southern Cal has lost as many games as it had. I've seen it a couple of times. It's got talent, and I mean, you can blame coaching and also kind of use a coaching word, culture. The culture there is always kind of iffy. I think Southern Cal a lot of times just kind of sleepwalks through games. It doesn't get up for all games. But Notre Dame, a chance to ruin Notre Dame's season, that will get Southern Cal's attention. So I think that's a very plausible outcome. Is that USC upsets Notre Dame uh, and maybe gives a path for Tennessee to make the playoff.
Yeah, I'll give you a couple elements to maybe support your theory there that Notre Dame losing to Southern Cal might be the best option for Tennessee. Number one, Lincoln Riley triggered a quarterback change before last week's win against Nebraska. So if there's this idea that like the team's going to pack it in behind a struggling Miller loss, I mean the team might still pack it in, but at least at quarterback, the new quarterback for USC, Jaden Mayava, I mean, he's got a lot to play for here. He just won the starting job mid-season. Now this is his chance to prove that he's the guy. He played very well on Saturday in a win against Nebraska. So that sort of maybe supports your theory that with this quarterback change, maybe that gives USC new life in what's otherwise been a disappointing season. The other thing, John, is USC is 0-4 on the road this year. Travel in the Big Ten has not gone well for the left coasters, and so that's contributed to this bad season, this flop of a season for USC. However, that game against Notre Dame is at home, and so you put aside USC's 0-4 record on the road, and they're 5-1 in either home games or neutral site games. And the only game they lost, they were beating Penn State, if memory serves. For much of that game, Penn State rallied and won by 3 points, and Penn State is now positioned as a playoff team. So that was a close loss to a good team. And so with that game being at USC, I do think like that's one that probably a lot of analysts aren't spending a lot of time on with how well Notre Dame's playing combined with USC's record. I think that's being chalked up as a win for Notre Dame. But when you really unpack this and look at Southern Cal's record at home versus road, and knowing that game is going to be at home, I do think that is an avenue for Tennessee to get in, is Notre Dame losing in that game.
Yeah, I think so too. I think when I look at the other games, um, point spread's reasonable on Ole Miss at Florida. Florida's coming off a big win over LSU. Florida hung tough against Georgia, even when it was using a third string quarterback. It's got DJ Lagway back. But I thought the victory over LSU probably said more about LSU than it did about Ole Miss. I kind of look at LSU now as a team that doesn't care a whole lot.
Mm.
It's whatever goals it's had are pretty much gone. I would be surprised if Ole Miss didn't come on strong in the swamp, because everything's right there for the Rebels, and got a good coach. They've got the coaching advantage. DJ Lagway, really like him as a quarterback, but Jackson Dart's Ole Miss's quarterback he's a legitimate Heisman candidate, and Ole Miss's defense is playing pretty well.
Yeah, Lagway going up against Ole Miss's defense is going to be a totally different animal than going up against that soft defense of
Yes.
LSU. And I don't want to take away from. I mean, this was a big win for Florida. It really
Yeah.
was. It was the first, I thought, real substantive, um, victory for Florida. They've been close. They'd already released this tepid vote of confidence for Billy Napier, which we discussed. But this was a tangible triumph that you could hang your hat on and say, hey, the future might be brighter than the present. But Florida's going to go up from against facing maybe the worst defense in the SEC and LSU, and what some of us think is the best defense in the SEC and Ole Miss. So that's going to be a tough one. I agree. It's not automatic. It's not a layup for Ole Miss. It's not a layup that it would have been without Lagway. So with Lagway back, that calls that into question a little bit. But I agree with you. I think Ole Miss gets it done there, because Ole Miss not only at this point do they have the playoff in their grasp, they might also have a first round hosting situation in their grasp. If they beat Florida convincingly and then crush Mississippi State in the Egg Bowl, which I think they will, they could have an argument to be seeded 7th or 8th in the playoff and be not only in the field but hosting a first round game. How about the Indiana option, John? That's in what's kind of a weak Saturday of games. That's the marquee game this weekend in a matchup that has major implications in the SEC's quest to get 5 playoff teams. Is Indiana undefeated but lacking much strength of schedule going up against Ohio State? How much chance do you give that one for opening up a path for Tennessee, being that the Hoosiers could get blown out by Ohio State? Do you give that much credence?
I think it's amusing that we're talking about a 10-0 team and talking about it getting the possibility it'll just get blown out.
Mm.
But that's the reality of it. Indiana has not played a difficult schedule. I don't think it's beaten any team with 4 losses, with fewer than 4 losses. Uh, so I look at Indiana. When I looked at it, I haven't seen it the last few weeks. It really passes the eye test. Passes the eye test better than Tennessee does.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Well-rounded team, plays better defense than I thought, and a really balanced offense. I don't think quietly. If you'd asked me this 3 weeks ago, I would have said there's no way Indiana's getting blown out. Ohio State might not win the game, but it's not getting blown out. It hasn't shown any glaring flaws to me. But it kind of struggled against Michigan. That proved to be a close game. And Michigan, forget the logo. This is a really ordinary Michigan team. And I wonder about Indiana. I wonder about teams like Indiana as they go deeper into the season. I doubt Indiana has the same quality of depth that Ohio State does. You just look at the recruiting rankings, you got to consider that at some point. So I wonder when Indiana gets a player bunged up, he's not 100%. When it goes a little deeper into its depth chart, if it's as good as it was, whereas Ohio State can sustain a loss and a player through injury and still be pretty strong. So I guess maybe the possibility is greater for an upset now. I mean, for a one-sided game than I thought it was a few weeks ago. But I don't know that Ohio State is a super team either. And I guess when we talk about blowout, uh, does the committee really want to put 5 SEC teams in the playoff and 3 from the Big Ten when the SEC's commissioners kind of made it like, well, it's us in the Big Ten. We're up here in our own little category. Everybody else is kind of beneath us, even the other Power Four conferences. So I wonder, that to me factors into it. Do you want 5 SEC teams and 3 Big Ten teams? So what constitutes a blowout? Is it a 20-point win?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a 28-point win?
I think it's a more lopsided result than what Tennessee had against Georgia. I mean, if the conversation comes down to Indiana and Tennessee, these were 2 teams that were close in the rankings last week. Indiana was 5, Tennessee was 7. The week before that, Tennessee was 1 spot ahead of Indiana. So the committee's been viewing these teams kind of similarly. Even though Tennessee has 1 loss, they also have the marquee win against Alabama. So I think the committee's been looking at these teams similarly. So if that continues, and you say, well, Tennessee just lost on the road by 14 points at Georgia, I think for this idea to be a starter for Tennessee, Indiana would need to lose by more than 2 possessions. They need to lose by more than 14. Ohio State needs to win by 17 plus, and I just don't know. I mean, I don't know what Ohio State's incentive is to do that. I mean, of course, you always try to win as much as you can, right? But I mean, is there really some great incentive for Ohio State to blow them out? Or if Ohio State gets up by 10 points, could they just sort of rest on their defense? We've seen Kirby Smart do this at different times in his team tenure when he knows he has a team beat and he's not real worried about him. He says, let's just not hand him the win on turnovers. Let's dial it back. We got our defense here that we trust. We'll beat them by 10, 12 points, and that's that. It feels like to me it could be that type of game. And if that's the case, I don't see that helping Tennessee enough. Or the other possibility, John, is Indiana just beats Ohio State and they're both going to the playoff because a loss would not knock Ohio State out. And that removes that entirely as a possibility for Tennessee. Then they would really be needing Ole Miss, Penn State, or Notre Dame to lose sometime in the next 2 weeks.
See, I think 20 is kind of the magic number.
Mm-hmm.
I think Ohio State needs to win that game by 20 or more.
That's fair.
And there's no incentive for Ohio State to do that. It's not as though it needs to win by a huge number of points to say it belongs in the playoff. It just wins the game. It's in the playoffs. It doesn't have to worry about that. Uh, so I think that would be the kind of the magic number. Uh, you know, Tennessee didn't help itself last Saturday. That's the point you can't ignore. It had every opportunity to pretty much wrap up a playoff bid with a win. But it really in the second half it wasn't a close game. You can't if you watch the game, if you're on the selection committee, you don't come away from the game saying, "Well, that could have gone either way."
Right.
You,
Yeah,
you,
and the other thing, John, is it confirmed some of the selection committee's red flags about Tennessee that they had the last couple of weeks. Ward Manuel, the selection committee chairman, who's the AD at Michigan, said after last week's rankings that the committee had concerns about Tennessee's offense. The committee, fairly or unfairly, and I do think it is fair, they value teams that play complementary football, that can get it done on offense and defense. Like in close ranking scenarios, they tend to like the teams that play well on both sides of the ball. And that's why they've been so impressed by Indiana, despite the schedule. Indiana has looked really good on the eye test on both sides of the ball, but they were concerned about Tennessee's offense. Well, then what's the offense go out and do? It does exactly what it's done all season, not much. And so okay, you hang your hat on the defense, dance with the one who brought you. That's what had gotten Tennessee to that point. And the defense didn't sack Carson Beck. He had plenty of time. Carson Beck, revived hit the idea that he's a first round NFL draft pick, played really well despite some drops by his receivers. And really, as that game went on, the longer and longer that game went, Georgia was doing whatever it wanted against Tennessee's defense. So it confirmed the concerns about Tennessee's offense that the committee already had. And I think it called into question whether the defense is enough to go out and beat a quality opponent, particularly on the road, John, because that's the other thing too. Tennessee's been great at Neyland Stadium under Josh Heupel, but going on the road and beating a decent opponent still is a challenge for this program. And even if they get into the playoff, that's probably what they're going to have to do. If they get into the playoff, it's going to be playing a first round road game. And so I'm not saying that's an argument to keep them out. I hate this idea of projecting the final scores of mythical matchups should factor into determining the field. I don't like that, but so I don't think that should be the determining factor. But I'm just envisioning Tennessee getting in on like the 11 seed line. They would need to go on the road and beat a good team, and I question whether they could do that anyway.
yeah, I think Tennessee's defense faltered against Georgia too, and so that raised a question. Before that game, you could say, well, nobody scored more than 19 on Tennessee. So Tennessee's defense will keep it in a game. You don't have to worry about Tennessee going into the playoffs and embarrassing you if you select it. It's not going to get blown out because its defense will keep it in the game. Its defense didn't come through against Georgia. It looked pretty ordinary, in fact, against a Georgia team that had 3 running backs out with injuries, had a couple of other injuries, but was able to throw the ball effectively throughout the game. So you lose that. I think, yeah, when I look at the thing that helps Tennessee really, I mean, the shining light is the win over Alabama. And if Tennessee could have pulled that off in Tuscaloosa, it would
Hmm.
resonate even more because then you'd have that road win you're talking about. You're right. Tennessee hasn't been good on the road. Something else in Tennessee's favor, though, it seems like all these teams in the running for the playoffs uh, have flaws. You can point to games and say, well, man, Ohio State couldn't do anything against Nebraska. Uh, you can take out Notre Dame lost to Northern Illinois. My goodness, you can take them one by one and look at it that way. So uh, Tennessee certainly has a shot, but when you point to these games like Penn State at Minnesota, this is the kind of game. Yeah, Minnesota's like 6-4 now.
Hmm.
Uh, this is the kind of game Penn State usually wins. That's one thing Penn State has been good at. It doesn't stumble and lose games it's not supposed to lose usually. Its problems are dealing with teams supposedly on the higher ground. But James Franklin's been pretty good in these kind of games. So uh, I don't favor Minnesota helping Tennessee out.
One more thought on this topic, John, before we move on to the implosion of LSU's season. But final thought on this idea of Tennessee still having avenues to the playoff. I'm going to throw one more at you. The conference championship race is not as murky as it once was. It's still undecided, but it's gaining some clarity as a few teams sort of exit the stage, including LSU last weekend. One of the teams in Atlanta is probably going to be one of the Texas schools. Texas A&M plays Auburn this weekend. Texas plays Kentucky. Let's say both those teams win. A&M and Texas win. That would mean one of them will be going to Atlanta in the SEC championship game. Whoever wins the Texas A&M Texas game would account for one of the spots in the SEC championship game. In that scenario, Alabama would be the opponent in the SEC championship game. In this glob of SEC teams that have two conference losses, Alabama is at the head of the line to play in the SEC championship. So let's say it's Texas against Alabama or Texas A&M against Alabama in the SEC championship game, and Alabama loses. That would be Alabama's third loss. Do you think a loss in Atlanta while Tennessee sits at home would be enough, combined with the fact that Tennessee beat Alabama, to swap Alabama out and Tennessee in if it came down to a choice between those two? Could Tennessee hang its hat on, hey, we beat Alabama, and then Alabama just went to Atlanta and lost to, say, Texas? How do you put Alabama in with three losses when Tennessee beat them? Do you think that's a winning argument for Tennessee?
It wouldn't be with me. I have a hard time penalizing a team that makes the SEC championship game because it plays an extra game against a really good team,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps a top five team. So if Alabama lost to Texas and Texas had won out, and you're looking at Texas maybe being number two in the country,
Mm-hmm.
and it loses that game. And so, yeah, Alabama's strength of schedule would be so much better than Tennessee's. And you start when you talk about Alabama now and Tennessee, you kind of have to put Georgia in there too because Alabama beat Georgia, Tennessee lost to Georgia. So that to me sways me more toward Alabama. And also Alabama lost to Tennessee at Neyland Stadium, one of the best home field advantages in college football. So if it had lost at Tuscaloosa, I would look at it very differently. But a close loss at Neyland Stadium doesn't sway me that way. Do you have a problem with that, or the idea of you lose out of the playoff because you made the SEC championship game and lost to a good team?
I struggle with that idea as well, John, and it would be different if they lost to Texas A&M. I think because Texas A&M has two losses already. If they beat Texas and it's A&M in Atlanta, I don't know if I would have as much of a problem knocking Alabama out. but it wouldn't be Tennessee taking the spot necessarily. Texas A&M could take Alabama's place in the playoff, and you could have a playoff at that point of Texas A&M, two-loss Texas, Georgia, and Ole Miss. Now, maybe Texas is in trouble with two losses and a loss to Texas A&M. I don't know, but I wouldn't have as much of a problem with it if it's Texas A&M, because that would be a team below you in the rankings that has two losses knocking you out. I think I would have a problem with Alabama being knocked out if they're losing to 11-1 Texas, an 11-1 Texas team that, yeah, maybe they don't have that many marquee wins, but at that point they would have beaten Texas A&M on the road, and then they beat Alabama in Atlanta. I think that confirms Texas is a really, really good team in this hypothetical we're talking about. So, yeah, I think if Texas beats Alabama in the SEC championship, I would have a tough time based on that result saying, okay, Alabama no longer deserves to be in the field. Like, in this hypothetical, what we're talking about, Texas is going to be number 2 in the country. And so you get to Atlanta and you lose the number 2 team in the country and you lose your playoff spot because of that. That just doesn't make sense. I think it is a different conversation if it's Texas A&M beating you in the SEC championship game.
Blake, what do you think about this scenario? And I don't think it's out of the question at all. Texas A&M is only a 2.5-point favorite against Auburn this week. What if Texas A&M beats Auburn? I mean, loses to Auburn, then turns around and beats Texas in that showdown in the regular season finale.
Yeah, in that scenario, John, I believe your SEC championship game is going to become Alabama and Georgia. And if that were the case, I think your teams from the SEC would be Alabama, Georgia, Ole Miss, and maybe Tennessee at that point. If we're talking about A&M losing to Auburn, that eliminates them from the conversation. And then if Texas A&M, on the heels of losing to Auburn, beats Texas, that probably eliminates Texas from the conversation. And things clarify a little bit. You have Georgia and Alabama and Atlanta both get into the playoff, Ole Miss and Tennessee as well. So, yeah, there's another little magic scenario, I think, for Tennessee is Auburn beating A&M and then A&M beating Texas. So, point being, I mean, we've touched on just 5 of them, John, but Tennessee doesn't necessarily control its destination. And we record this before Tuesday night's playoff rankings. But as we see it, we don't think Tennessee has full control over its destination. But there are many, many avenues for Tennessee still to make the playoff if they get to 10-2. A team where the avenues have dried up, John, are LSU. You know, it keeps getting worse for Brian Kelly's third season. He's now lost 3 straight, 4 losses overall this season, and this one at Florida, just it's a stinker. You know, I know Florida's improving. DJ Lagway was back, all those things, but LSU had the ball most of the game. They spent a fair amount of time in Florida territory, but just couldn't come away with points on enough of those drives. And their defense crumbled in the clutch. The idea of LSU's defense being much improved this year, I think we can kind of put that one to bed. They're maybe slightly improved, but that's only because last year's defense was so disastrous. They still have one of the worst defenses in the SEC. So now we're in a scenario where Brian Kelly is probably still an unfireable man because it would cost like $70 million stuffed into his pocket to fire him. So I don't think we're talking about Brian Kelly in trouble for his job at this point, but the mercury is rising on his tenure in Baton Rouge. Brian Kelly also helped by the fact that he has a very nice recruiting class lined up, which includes the nation's number 1 overall quarterback prospect, Bryce Underwood, a 5-star recruit from Michigan, is committed to LSU's class. So, you know, I think if we're constraining this conversation to the bounds of realism, I don't think Brian Kelly's getting fired in the next 2 weeks. However, what does this make you think about the direction of his tenure, John? Because it always seemed like a little bit of an odd cultural fit, but I know you and I are willing to put that aside when we consider the idea of winners. Like winning is the ultimate culture, right? I don't care where you could be from Mars coaching in the deep south, and if you win, they're going to say, you are our favorite Martian ever. We will build you a statue. But if you lose, then I think, you know, those culture questions start to be raised and all that goes with that. So How are you viewing Brian Kelly's tenure right now? Because it certainly feels like it's at a crossroads.
It really does. This was kind of supposed to be his year. I mean, he started out, he won 10 games each of his first 2 seasons. You expect the team moving upward, not backward. You're always got a problem when you're going the wrong way. And it's going the wrong way right now. Yeah, the recruiting class helps, but what struck me about that Florida game, and I give Florida all the credit in the world, but I kind of thought I just had to feel like LSU's just mailing it in. After that Alabama game, I know it still had possibilities, but that's the take I had from that game. And I just see we're talking about you talk about the defense. It's not just the defense. I mean, Garrett Nussmeyer hasn't played as well as I thought he would. He got off to a great start. I thought he might be the best quarterback in the SEC. Um, and then we have instances on the sideline with Brian Kelly screaming again. I mean, Nick Saban screamed at people all the time on the sidelines. But as you pointed out, when you win, doesn't matter where you're from, doesn't matter when you scream or at whom you scream. If you win, it's all good. You're fiery.
Hmm.
You're laying down the law, and you got your team, got your team's mind right. Now when you're losing and yelling at players, oh, he's unhinged. So, but I really think a big factor right now with Brian Kelly in that Florida game, it wasn't just that you lost to Florida. You lost to a coach that seemingly has been on the hot seat ever since he was fired, and Billy Napier. And I know he's been given another year, but if Billy Napier's fired at any time, would it surprise anyone? No. So you're talking about a coach who's lived on the hot seat, and you can't beat him. I think that hurts Brian Kelly too. But again, how much does it hurt? You're not going to fire him. So I don't know.
You're not going to fire him this year. Do you think if next year is a repeat of this year that LSU could fire him after 10 seasons when they awarded him a 10-year fully guaranteed contract? Do you think it comes into play next year? Is this, I guess what I'm asking is this a make or break year 4 coming up for Brian Kelly? And when I say make or break, I'm not necessarily talking about hoisting the trophy at the end of the season, but making the playoff or being right at the door of playoff contention at the very least. Do you think year 4 could be make or break for his tenure? And if it's a repeat of this year, could end in a firing?
I don't know how much the buyout would drop in another year.
I think it'd be like still 60 million.
Gosh, I just don't think LSU has Texas A&M money. I really don't. I think they gotta hope Brian Kelly can get the program going at a higher level. I just can't see LSU coming up with that kind of money.
Yeah, and Bryce Underwood on the way is great, and they need to get him in the boat. I mean, he's not signed on the dotted line yet. Signing period begins in December, and there's been a well publicized pursuit from the Michigan Wolverines. Now, Underwood's commitment has held so far, and signing day can't get here fast enough for LSU. But there are other valuable members of that recruiting class because they need help all over the place. As you mentioned, Nussmeyer has regressed a little bit, but in his defense, like LSU has no run game. And I think by this point in the season, opponents aren't fearing that run game at all. So they can pin their ears back and get after the quarterback. I mean, there are so many things LSU has to address. They need to become more balanced. They need to be able to run the football a little bit. They need to be able to tackle. I mean, what happened to DBU? They can't cover anymore. I mean, there are so many things that LSU has to address. And I think Brian Kelly has to be more willing to go after some A-list transfers. He wants to build his program through like the Kirby Smart model of sign and develop blue chippers. And that's fine, but I mean, LSU needs some help next year. The personnel just isn't classic LSU personnel to be able to think that a bunch of freshmen are going to be able to come in and everything's going to be fine suddenly next year. And you don't get a never-ending runway. And so I think Kelly, who's been a little bit lukewarm toward the portal, I mean, he got Jaden Daniels, yes, and he's got some like warm bodies to fill out the end of the depth chart, but really hasn't been in there landing a ton of punches in the transfer portal. I think he's going to need a few marquee guys to help next year. It's not necessarily the quantity that he needs, but I think he needs some quality guys to go along with this recruiting class to be able to show next year, like, hey, everything's fine here.
Blake, what do you think about Garrett Nussmeier? Does he go pro after this year? Does he come back for another year? He's only had one really full year as a starter.
I these draft wonks are kind of hard to read, and I will not pretend to be a draft expert, John. That is not my forte. But as I understand it, Nussmeier is pretty valued, I guess, in the NFL draft, and I don't know that this is going to be the strongest year for quarterbacks in the draft. So from that perspective, I think it might behoove Nussmeier to come out now, because I think this is a moment with this draft class and with the way draft scouts view his abilities, that even though he's just been a 1-year starter, from his pro prospects, he could come out now. Now, from LSU's sense, I think it would be fantastic if he came back for another season, because that gives you some cushion there. If Bryce Underwood's not ready in week 1, you would have a proven quarterback ready to go for one more season, and then you segue to Underwood if necessary. But if I'm Nussmeier, and this like blue chip recruits coming in, you sure don't want to lose your starting job, particularly if you think you're going to be a day 1 or day 2 NFL draft pick. I mean, I would think it would be, again, not an NFL draft expert speaking here, but based on reading coverage from other people who bill themselves as draft experts, I think it's probably in Garrett Nussmeier's best interest if he says, thanks for the memories. I'm off for the bigger paycheck in the NFL, particularly because, like I said, this is not a really deep class of college quarterbacks coming out after this season. What do you think, John, about the idea of this could be like Nick Saban's year 3 hiccup at LSU? We always talk about how the 3 predecessors to Brian Kelly all won a national championship with the Tigers. Nick Saban, Ed Ogeron, and Les Miles in between them. But Saban did it in year 4. And year 3 was underwhelming. LSU came in preseason ranked. They went 8-5. And so in a lot of ways, it could be comparable to this season. LSU came into this season ranked, kind of in the middle of the top 25, had playoff aspirations, and then it becomes a flop, and they could finish somewhere around year 5. Now, the difference is the program wasn't humming before Saban got there, and it just wasn't a straight climb after Saban arrived. He'd raised the bar in his first 2 seasons. Saban won 10 games in year 2, which is what Brian Kelly did, and then took a step back in year 3, came back in year 4, and Nick Saban won the national championship at LSU. Do you think, can that provide any sort of cover? Is that even a worthy conversation to bring up when it comes to Brian Kelly, or is the situation just altogether different because of where the program was before Nick Saban arrived?
Yeah, I kind of think it's altogether different. However, one thing about I can't ignore when I'm thinking about LSU. When I think about its best teams, and you alluded to this earlier, when I think about its best teams and I think about this team, the players on defense,
Mm-hmm.
I just don't see the talent, not even comparable. So to me, what has to happen is he's got to fix his defense. Uh, Look at Ole Miss with Lane Kiffin. He's done really well at Ole Miss. Um, but this is the year where it's really kind of all come together. This team is better than the others. Maybe it'll get upset at Florida, and we won't be talking about that. But talent wise, when you look at this Ole Miss roster, this to me is as talented a team as there is. Doesn't mean it will win out, but it's talented. And I see the difference in this Ole Miss defense and the previous defensive models in Oxford. They just didn't have this kind of defensive talent or depth. Good offense, but now look at his Ole Miss as a complete team. That's what Brian Kelly has to do. You mentioned it earlier. He needs to go where Nick Saban has gone. He needs to go to the portal and get positive results. He's really got to help that defense. And I think the best way to do that is through the portal. And we talk about, well, LSU can't pay his buyout, but it can pay NIL money. And it's done that.
Mhm.
And it's done it in other sports. That to me is the way out and the way up for LSU. Go to the portal, get you some defensive guys that can play, and that'll turn things around.
Yeah, you're right. I think he's got to mimic a little bit of the Lane Kiffin playbook. I don't know if he needs to go quite as heavy in the portal because you still want to sign these like 30 guys that are committed to your class. Those guys are important for long term, but you got to go out and get some portal A-listers too on defense because you're absolutely right, John. That took a average Ole Miss defense and made it into one of the best defenses in the country, and that's why we're talking about Ole Miss not only as a possible playoff team, but possibly being in position to host a first round playoff game. John, before we get to the picks, I want to pivot into this idea for you because we talk about this log jam in the SEC standings. And I think there's a theory going around. Well, I know there's a theory going around that some teams may not actually want to play in their conference championship games. I wrote this on Sunday when looking at it through the lens of the Big Ten, John. I think Penn State is in like a prime playoff position. They go out and beat Minnesota and Maryland, and Penn State can sit at home on conference championship weekend and watch Oregon and either Ohio State or Indiana try to bludgeon one another, while Penn State sits back, relaxes, watches a little film, and says, "Thank you very much for the 11-1 record. We are cruising into the number 6 seed or thereabouts in the playoff bracket. And oh, also thank you very much. We will host a first round playoff game without even making our conference championship game." So, what do you think about the whole thing of like, do you actually want to play in the SEC championship or do you not? Because if you don't play in the SEC championship game, there's no chance for a first round bye. You can't get the bye without winning the conference title. On the other hand, if you feel like you got a pretty good playoff case and you think you're going to be in the field, do you really want to put it on the line for another week? Risk injury, risk getting beat up, not have a weekend off. What do you think the better avenue is for a team like Alabama or a team like Georgia that's probably in the field regardless? Would you rather be in Atlanta if you had the choice and try to go get that bye? Or would you rather sit at home and rest up and say, seat us wherever you want? We're in the playoff and we think we can win the whole thing.
I'd much rather not play in the SEC championship game. In fact, I want to do away with conference playoff games altogether. So, but I
It,
won't get it.
I think that argument works in the SEC and the Big Ten, maybe. I don't think that argument works like in the Big 12 or the ACC. Like, how would you decide who gets the Big 12's bid if not for the conference championship game? Or maybe you're just going to do away with the Big 12's bid. I don't know.
No, yeah, I would. You could still just be the best regular season team, the team with the best regular season record, ranked the highest. That's what I would go with. I just think nobody's saying, "Man, we got in the SEC." People aren't saying, "Man, we got to get to Atlanta." No, they're saying we got to get to the playoffs. But I'm off. I'm off topic here. Uh, we can talk about that at another time. As far, but not playing in the SEC championship game to me is an advantage. You talk about a bye. I'd rather have my bye at the end of the regular season. That's when I like my bye, and I don't have
That's
to
kind
go
of a good
play.
point. That you could see that as a buy. You rest up before the
Yeah,
playoffs, and yeah, you got to go in the first round, but you got fresh legs against teams that against a possible opponent that just lost its conference championship game.
yeah, and let's take. Well, you mentioned Alabama and Georgia. Alabama's got to play. It's got to close out its regular season with Auburn, and I don't care what Auburn's record is. That's a hard game.
Hmm.
That's to me the biggest rivalry in the world. I mean, those teams go at it, and I think the Iron Bowl. Yeah, I would. You got to play that game, and you got to turn around and play an SEC championship game. Much rather not have that game the next week in Atlanta. Same way with Georgia. Georgia Tech's already beaten Miami this year. Georgia Tech's played some good games, and it would love nothing more than to upset Georgia. So Georgia too is going to have a tough regular season game to close out the season. Texas A&M, they play each other. Tough rivalry game. That's when I'd want my bye. And then I'll
Hmm.
take my chances later on. But I'm going to have more time to prepare for the first round of the playoffs. So I'll take my chances.
That's a really good point, John. We didn't get many points in our picks last week. In fact, I got no points in our picks. John, I knew this day was coming. It was all too good to be true. It was like Tennessee's first quarter in Athens on Saturday night. You're feeling good about yourself early, but you know reality's coming. And reality came for you and I in our picks contest last week. I had my first winless week Saturday, John. It was brutal. I thought, oh, maybe my lock Utah can get the backdoor cover. No, Colorado pulled away from them. Tennessee with that 9 points in their pocket. I thought, maybe they'll only lose by a touchdown. No, Georgia added a late score, won by 14. I couldn't find a win anywhere, so I went 0-5. I'm now all the way down to 500, 34-34. You didn't do much better. You went 1-4, but that was enough to pull you into a tie alongside me. So I believe for the first time all season, John, we are tied and we're at 34 apiece in the picks conference standings, in danger of slipping below 500.
See that there's a message in that to all people who think they're going to make a lot of money betting, supplement their income, maybe get the vacation they've never had. You're not going to get it by betting on games. As good as you were early in the year and the way you started out, what were you like? Something like 16-5, some
Yeah.
outrageous
Mm-hmm.
stat. And we talked about it. We knew it was coming. If you pick long enough and you pick all these SEC games, it's coming. You're gonna get close to that 500 mark. And if you're at 500, you're not on level ground. You're losing money because you're paying the juice. So yeah, that's the moral of that story. We saw it was coming, and now we got to find a way to snap out of the tailspin, and it'll just be probably a matter of luck.
It's like the person at the blackjack table, John, that's up a few chips. Like if you double your stack at the blackjack table, you better say color coming in. Point me to the cashier's cage, because if you sit there long enough, you're going to give back everything you won and then some. But hey, it's not over until you walk away from the table. So we got more games to pick this week. Let's start with one we've touched on, John, and that is Ole Miss, a 10-point favorite at Florida. You buying in to the Billy Napier revival? Will the good times keep rolling in the swamp? Ole Miss favored by 10. Who are you taking?
I'm going to take Ole Miss. I just think there's so much in play here for Ole Miss. And I know it's tough winning in the swamp when Florida's competitive. But when I start looking at those depth charts, when I look at quarterback, when I look at receivers, when I look at that defensive front, Ole Miss is pretty much better everywhere. And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, Florida played Georgia a good game, but it still lost by 14. It could play Ole Miss a good game too and lose by 17. So I'm going with Ole Miss.
Yeah, me too. I think this is a bad matchup for Florida. Like DJ Lagway is still not 100% coming off that hamstring injury, which made it all the more remarkable what he did last week. But we know Ole Miss's defensive line is so good. So if they can win the battle at the line of scrimmage, I think that puts Lagway in a really tough spot. And you hit on it. So much on the line for Ole Miss here. And I would think Lane Kiffin lets his players know that. It's not just the playoffs on the line here, it's the chance to possibly host a first round playoff game if they take care of business in their next two. So, like you, I will give the 10 points and take Ole Miss. One we haven't talked about, John, Kentucky at Texas. Texas, a 20.5-point favorite. Texas was involved in the only game you got right last week. I had it wrong. You took Arkansas and the points, and you got that one right because Texas only won 20 to 10. Texas is a team that, you know, they're getting by. I mean, they're standing here at 9-1, and they lack the marquee win, but I still think this is a solid team on both sides of the ball. They had a disastrous first half on offense against Georgia in that loss. And yeah, that should be concerning here, but I am not out on Texas. I know it seems like a lot of the pundits are saying, why is Texas ranked so high? Where is their marquee win? I get it. I don't care where you rank them right now, because to me, this is going to be settled out when they go to College Station in a couple weeks' time. But I still really like Texas. I don't think they have a real glaring weakness. And, it was just a couple weeks ago that they destroyed Florida. So I'm going to trust Texas here, give the 20.5 points, and trust Texas to cover back home in Austin.
When I'm watching Texas play Team X, doesn't matter whom, I'm always thinking, why isn't Texas ahead by more now? Texas does great on the eye test. It's just got a lot of team speed. It can be physical up front. And then it has games that I don't understand. How did it beat Vanderbilt by only 3 points? How did it lose by 15 at home to Georgia? A lot of turnovers. Um, I think in this kind of game, for one thing, Kentucky's awful.
Yeah.
Let's be realistic. And this is a game where Texas needs to, I think it would be helpful for Texas to say, you don't need a 20-10 game like you had at Arkansas. This is a bad team. Put it away, win convincingly. I think Texas can do that. I just don't think Kentucky matches up with this team at all. I don't know where its points are coming from. I don't know how in the world it's going to hold Texas down. So I'll go with Texas also.
All right, moving along. How about Texas A&M? Just a 2.5 point favorite at Auburn. Auburn, they've been involved in a lot of close games this season. Usually come out on the losing end of things. Texas A&M still in the conference championship hunt, as we mentioned, which means you were in the college football playoff hunt as well. So is this a get right game for Auburn, John, or you have them dead and buried at this point?
No, I don't have Auburn dead and buried. When I watch Auburn play, I see a team that's more talented than its record says.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I think I was surprised though when the line came out. I thought A&M would be like a 6 point favorite. It's favored by 2.5. So that tells me the odds makers have already adjusted to this. And I can't help but think about the Aggies' history. Just when things are looking up for the A&M, look at the possibility. Win this game. I mean, you got Texas, your hated rival, coming up next. You're on the verge of great things. And how many times in that situation have we seen Texas A&M falter? And how many times have I been wrong thinking it wouldn't falter? But, sometimes we have chronic illnesses that can be mental too. And so again, I'll go with A&M thinking, well, surely it can do this. Surely it can win at Auburn by more than 2.5 points.
Stockholm syndrome, John. That's
Yes.
what you've developed with Texas A&M
Yeah.
quite clearly, and I had it for quite some time too, and it was threatening me again this season. But I'm changing, and I'm picking Auburn here. I'm taking the 2.5 points for one clear reason, and that's because I am reevaluating Texas A&M's win against LSU. At the time that looked like this great victory that put A&M in the playoff conversation. They're still in the playoff conversation, but they went out the following week and they got absolutely pasted by South Carolina. And now we're starting to think like, well, how good is LSU? They just lost in blowout fashion to Alabama and lost by 2 scores to Florida. So it's kind of got me rethinking Texas A&M, John. And so, yeah, trust in Auburn this season is a fool's errand. But I guess after I went 0-5 last week, maybe I proved myself the fool. So I'll do it again, and I will take Auburn and the 2.5 points because I'm rethinking A&M as I rethink LSU as well. It's a lot of questioning myself, maybe too much here, John. How about Alabama 13.5 point favorite at Oklahoma? I'm going to start off here. I think Alabama's getting better. I think all those concerns about them in the middle of the season were legitimate, but the sign of a good coach is improving your team as the season's gone along. And what's Alabama done the last few weeks? They absolutely destroyed Missouri. They absolutely destroyed LSU. And I know it's an FCS team, but there was no drama there. They absolutely destroyed Mercer. And I think they're going to destroy Oklahoma. So I'll give the 13.5 points. Take the Tide.
I agree with you on that. Yes, Alabama's getting better. What can you say about Oklahoma?
They're not getting better.
No. The same team we saw in the first SEC game, that's the team we see now. Receiving, I guess the receiving core has been it's been injured all year. It's as though these guys are on life support. They just can't get back on the field. Offensive line spotty at best. Quarterback play. I assume they're still going with Jackson Arnold. They haven't demoted him again, have they?
I don't know if you can demote a guy another time. I think if you demote a guy again, John, he just suddenly appears in the transfer portal. Like those are the rules. You get demoted twice in the same season, and you cease to exist where you're at and get sucked into the portal. So no, I don't think they've demoted him another time. But still early in the week.
No, I like what's going on with Alabama, so I'll go with Alabama there.
All right, one more, John, in this kind of lackluster week of games for the SEC before we get to our lock of the week. Vanderbilt off a bye week. You know what they say about giving Clark Lee an extra week to prepare, John? Well,
Mm.
he is a 7.5 point. You seem puzzled. You don't know what they
I
say
didn't
about
know that.
Clark Lee?
I didn't know they said anything about Clark Lee.
I may have made that up.
Oh, okay.
It's possible I had tongue in cheek as I said that, but
Yes.
yeah, Vanderbilt going to LSU. Uh, LSU a 7.5 point favorite. Do the Fighting Tigers have any fight left in him? John, can they hold off Vanderbilt, or you like those 7.5 points at your side?
I don't like anything about LSU right now, but I really wonder about Vanderbilt. What I talked about earlier about teams getting kind of beat up as the season goes along. I don't know about its quarterback, Diego Pavia, how healthy he is at that point, and everything rests with him uh,
Mm-hmm.
on offense. So, gosh, I may be headed for my own 0-5 week when I look at these picks. I'll take LSU and give the points.
I'm terrified of this one, John, because I think Vanderbilt is the type of team that can continue to give LSU fits. I mean, they run, they run an offense that you don't see much in the SEC. It's sort of like a modern day option offense, and if you do anything outside the box, LSU's defense is just completely befuddled.
Sheer
They
panic sets in. Yeah.
that's right. I mean, how many of LSU's receivers are going to even show up after getting torn to shreds on the sidelines by Brian Kelly? So it goes against all logic, John, but maybe the idea is the last time we saw Vanderbilt, they were looking not very good against South Carolina. They looked a little bit beat down, wore out, lacking a little depth, some of the things you've been touching on. But I don't trust LSU at all, but nonetheless, I will also give the points and take LSU alongside you. And that brings us to our locks of the week. I think last week, John, might have been the first time we both missed on our locks. So, what do you got in store for us in the lock aisle this week?
Going back to basics.
I like
Going
this.
back to
Kent
basics.
State.
A lot of coaches say that when troubled times is a sort of like rebooting. Yeah, we're just going to go back to preseason when we had some scrimmages. I'm going to go back to Kent State.
Here we go. hmm
It doesn't matter whom they're playing or what the point spread is. I'm just going back to Kent State. I
You're
don't care.
picking against Kent State. Well, they're a 10-point underdog against mighty Akron, John. You trust
Wh-
in 2-8 Akron to give those 10 points to Kent State?
I don't know what quarterback Kent State's down to. I've counted three. and maybe one guy, maybe their number one guys come back, or the number two guy, or maybe the number four guys beat out the number three guy in practice. Who knows? And I know Akron is really bad and really untrustworthy, but I think Kent State has that potential on any given Saturday. It can be the worst team in college football. And I'm going to rely on that. This is a crucial week for me, and I want to dance with the one that brung me. I want to dance with Kent State, and if I lose out, okay, I can live with that. But I don't want to be sitting here and saying, second, why didn't you pick Kent State? I'm
Mm,
picking Kent State. Well, I say picking Kent State. When I say I pick Kent State, I mean pick Kent State to
sure.
lose
Yeah,
handily.
no one that listens this deep to our podcast, John. If
Okay.
if our loyal listeners are this deep into the pod, they know your history picking against
Yeah.
Kent State. So it goes
Okay.
without saying. And a little clarity here, because I know this really is ostensibly a Kent State pod at this point. Kent State has had 4 different quarterbacks attempt to pass this season, John. So at some point this season, they were down to their 4th quarterback. I have no idea which one is starting in this midweek game against Akron. But okay, you're going back to your roots, giving the 10 points, and taking Akron. And I'm going to the Group of 5 ranks as well, John. San Jose State about played spoiler for a while on Boise State on Saturday, but then Ashton Ginty got into gear, revived his Heisman campaign, kept alive Boise State season. Well, now San Jose State has to play the other really, really strong team in the Mountain West, which is UNLV. UNLV just 1 spot behind Boise State, still alive actually for the college football playoff. If UNLV were to beat Boise State in the Mountain West Championship, that could unlock maybe an avenue for UNLV. Well, anyway, John, San Jose State, after that hard-fought game against Boise, they're now going to be on a short week. And so I am taking UNLV. They are a 7-point favorite. I will give those 7 points and say San Jose State, they just got nothing left in the tank after fighting so hard against Boise last weekend.
Uh, well, I admire you. You've got an affinity for the Mountain West, don't you? You've watched
Oh, it's
some of
one of my
those
favorite
games.
conference. It's one of my favorite conferences.
Yeah.
It is. It's always been that way in hoops too. I think you get outside like the power conferences. I think the Mountain West has some of the best college basketball, high mid-major college basketball. Although that conference is all changing. One thing that doesn't change is John and I on SEC Unfiltered, and John picking against Kent State. We'll see how he did next week. Hope you join us then. Thanks for listening to this edition of SEC Football Unfiltered.